We were at Tina's parents' house for a family get-together, and I was the only one that would sit at the table with Frank, Tina's ornery old grandpa. I actually liked Frank because he had opinions, but I was also waiting for somebody to acknowledge our new status, the fact that our life had just changed pretty dramatically. I wasn't going to have to drive a school bus anymore, and things were really looking up for Frank's oldest granddaughter, Tina. And he did acknowledge the change in our situation with this one sentence. You know, I used to patrol Randolph, and a lot of those officers were just trash. Frank was actually a military policeman there on Randolph back in the day. And that was all he said to acknowledge how things had changed for us. There was no acknowledgement that things were improving for us, that we were now renting a really nice, comfortable little home outside of Randolph Air Force Base, and Tina was able to just stay home and dote on our fussy little daughter. But again, it was that insecurity inside me, right? I wanted some sort of confirmation from Tina's family. She knew better than me to ever expect anything like that from her family because she grew up with them. She knew what they were like. But I still wanted to understand a little bit about how they were thinking. So once during an unusual conversation with Tina's dad, and I say unusual because we weren't talking about the weather or the new Walmart. So I took an opportunity to ask him. He'd never traveled much, right? Only to visit family. That was the only reason they ever traveled anywhere. So I asked him, I said, if you could live anywhere in the world, where would you want to live? And he thought about it for a second and he said, you know, I really liked Aunt Virginia's place up in Windcrest. Windcrest is a small community up on the northeast side of San Antonio, and it's kind of an aging upper middle class area, or at least it was back in the day. And I thought, wow, that's as far as his imagination could take him. And I shouldn't have been surprised. He did not choose his vocation. He's one of those that just kind of like fell into it in a job that was available, working with the grocery stores and delivering snacks and chips and that sort of thing to grocery stores. So he was a very simple man, and I just wrestled with these thoughts, like, because he seemed content with life, right? He didn't seem like he was chasing anything else, but it made me think, like, is it even okay to be that way? Like, shouldn't we always be striving for something more? Then it also made me think, why do I want any validation from him about my accomplishments? Like, he obviously doesn't care much about his own accomplishments. Why would he care about mine? So it just really made me think about my prideful ambitions and consider, maybe low expectations really are the key to happiness. I'm a couple of months into navigator training now, and after weeks of learning navigation logs and charts and all that stuff, we'd finally earned the right to wear the green flight suit, right? The coveralls, the classic pilot uniform, if you will. And I had mixed feelings about it because although it was very comfortable and it was fun to play with all the little zippers everywhere, I knew that when people saw that uniform, they thought of pilots. So I felt like an imposter wearing that. And that was sadly reinforced one time when I stopped after work to pick up some takeout. And the young girl behind the counter comes out from behind the counter and she goes, "Are you a pilot?" And she was almost batting her eyes. And I said, "No, I'm a navigator." And she just goes, "Oh," and whips her head around so fast and basically runs to the back. And I was like, yeah, that's to be expected. Obviously, I didn't care anything about this girl, but it just reinforced what I was already thinking about how people saw me. We had been in the actual flight training portion of the program now. This involved 4-hour flights around the southern United States in an old 737. This was one of the original 737s, but it was modified for navigator training. So there were workstations inside with radar scopes and that sort of thing. Well, we'd been doing this training for a few weeks now, and it was time for our check ride. And things looked like they were going to go downhill for me in training after this check ride. So I'll tell you what happened. There was another student that was paired up with me at my workstation, and he was having a little bit of a hard time, kind of struggled with going through the checklist, doing all the items that we needed to do prior to engine start. So I was helping him with this checklist, and we were reading through things and pushing the buttons, doing everything we were supposed to do. And then an instructor comes up to us and says, "What are you guys doing? You just failed your check ride. Look at your hands." And we looked down at the backs of our hands, and we weren't wearing our green Nomex gloves, the fireproof gloves. And my first thought was, wow, I just kind of sacrificed myself to help this guy out. And secondly, wait a minute, like if we really need to have fireproof gloves on before we start the engines, like if there's so much risk that the engines are going to catch fire when they start them, then maybe I don't want to be on this airplane anymore. Anyway, I did get a little concerned because I still had several months worth left of training and several more check rides, and the 3 strikes rule was in play here. So if I failed 2 more check rides, I would be out of the program. I tried to dismiss this failure as just a technicality, but it didn't really matter. The standards for aircrew were high. There were expectations, and I didn't meet those expectations. So now I was really having this internal struggle of feeling grateful for being there and also not really wanting to be there. I still didn't really want to be a navigator. Being in the training on the airplane just really reinforced my idea of being second class to the pilots. I just didn't feel like I was going to have enough responsibility to make me feel like what I was doing was important. But all of my classmates seemed to be fulfilled with this idea, right? Nobody else seemed to have these kinds of struggling thoughts that I was having, which made me feel really alone and feel like, why am I the only person that thinks this way? We even had a student in our class who had washed out of pilot training. And when I asked them how they felt about that, being here at Navigator School and not being able to be a pilot, the response was just a little more than like a shoulder shrug and a, man, they just didn't think much of it. So I just really wanted to relate to somebody on how I was feeling. And I didn't get that chance until we went on a trip to Florida, Pensacola, Florida. That evening I went to the fitness center to get a workout in, and I saw this guy come up off the floor with a red face. And it was Jeff, one of my buddies from my flight in OTS. I actually commissioned him. And I said, hey Jeff, how's the engineering gig going? Now, Jeff was in really good shape. He was very physically fit. He was very confident as a leader. He was a sharp guy. And so I was curious how he was adjusting to his role, because he didn't really strike me as an engineering type. So I asked him how he liked his job, and he basically said, dude, man, it's not what I thought it was going to be. I just work with a bunch of civilians, and we're working on projects that are years out in the future. And he was actually frustrated because he wasn't doing what he felt like was really important, like he was making a big contribution to the mission. And this was like, wow, somebody else that I can actually kind of relate to. And he said, I'm here training to get ready to take the Combat Rescue Officer fitness test. And I was like, wow, you want to be a crow? This was like the first person that I'd met that was like highly motivated, that wanted to do something really challenging that was, military-like. So this was a very fortunate experience for me to run into Jeff and just have this conversation and realize that I wasn't the only man that felt like they needed to be doing more. He was actually able to look past his uniform and see his job for what it actually was or was not. After 10 months of navigator training, graduation day was finally here. It was time for us to earn our silver wings. Tina was there with now 2-year-old Holly and our 4-month-old little boy on her lap. My buddy Brandon, who was getting closer to getting into the Air Force, into pilot training himself, was standing in the back. I was able to reflect back on how grateful I was that I didn't have any other failures and I was able to make it through training. But I was still shocked when they presented the Academic Achievement Award and they called Second Lieutenant Jason Hawkins. I did not expect to hear my name for that. And then afterward, my flight commander told me that I would have been in the running actually for top graduate in my class had I not forgotten to put my gloves on for that first check ride. Anyhow, that chapter of my life was behind us, and we were getting ready for our next assignment, which was going to be in Omaha, Nebraska. But before we could move, I needed to go around the base and do all my out-processing paperwork. So I stopped by the base clinic to get my records and get that paperwork taken care of. And leaving the clinic, I see a familiar looking vehicle in the parking lot. It was a Jeep Grand Cherokee that I'd remembered seeing parked outside of the PACAF building by the general's entrance in Hawaii. And then I walked closer to it and looked in the back, and sure enough, it had the Hawaii registration sticker on there. And I'm like, this has got to be General Peterson's vehicle. So I did a little awkward thing, but I wanted a chance to express some gratitude. I hadn't kept up with him and let him know that I got back into the Air Force. And so I took out a piece of paper and I scribbled a note on there and let him know that I was that I made it through navigator training and just wanted to thank him for all his help. And I stuck it underneath the windshield wiper. And then I went home. Once I got home, everything had been already packed up in the house, and there were only a few things left on the counter, including the telephone. My wife had left the phone plugged in, and the phone rings. She answers the phone, and she has a startled look on her face, and she hands the phone to me and says, "It's General Peterson." So he actually looked up my phone number in the phone book and gave me a call to wish us well. He had recently retired and moved back to Texas, which is where he was from. And so with that personal send-off from a general officer, we were on our way to Omaha, Nebraska, and I had no idea what to expect from there. In Chapter 12, I go on some deployments, and it's discovered that I'm a square peg trying to fit into a round hole, and my leadership needs to figure out what to do with me. So I hope you come back for that. Thanks for watching.